The Trump administration announced this week the 2020 census will ask respondents whether they are U.S. citizens for the first time in 70 years. And that has started a fierce debate in California, which has voted to become a sanctuary state. Joining me now from California, Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman and the Vice Chair of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, Shawn Nelson. California's Attorney General announced this week that he is suing the federal government for deciding to add that question to the census. Here was his reasoning.
An undercount resulting from this decision would jeopardize vital services for all Californians. It would also jeopardize our representation in government.
Mr. Nelson, is Congressman Becerra wrong, or in fact would you like to see California lose some seats in Congress and some federal money that is based on the large number of people in your state illegally?
Well, Attorney General Becerra, I just think is incorrect because the federal government has a right to conduct the census, and there's nothing that says they can't ask any particular question. I don't want California to miss out on anything, but I think the hysteria that answering questions is somehow going to force people away from a census, I just don't buy it. The government is precluded from sharing that information for 72 years after a person answers the census, and I think his time ought to be spent allaying the fears of people he thinks are going to be freaked out by having to answer questions.
Let me ask you, though, about the practical effect of it, because it's kind of an open question as we looked into it. Even the Supreme Court has not definitively ruled. Do you think that people who are in this country illegally should be counted when it's decided how you're going to apportion congressional seats and how you're going to divvy up federal money?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, if in the end we essentially import a few million citizens of other countries to game the system to get extra congressional seats, I suppose that presents a big question for power in Washington, D.C. I mean, we always just assume the count is for the citizens of a country, but California, where I've lived my whole life, obviously has a little different issue, and that poses a big problem.
Congressman Sherman, let me ask you the same question. Why should California or any state with a sizable number of illegal immigrants in its population benefit from that to get more federal money or to get more seats in Congress?
We're often shortchanged when it comes to federal money, and Congress can allocate the federal money however it chooses. The enumeration for the census is the allocation of House seats and seats in the Electoral College. And the Constitution is clear. You count all persons, except Indians, untaxed. Those are the words of the Constitution. Now, if people want to change the Constitution, there's a process for doing that. But instead, they seem to want to thwart the Constitution to achieve their result without an amendment by deliberately undercounting all immigrants, legal and illegal, and they've got a three-step program for doing that. Create massive fear, starting by calling immigrants rapists and murderers, deportations. The fear in Latino and Asian communities is palpable. Then you add this question, which the census itself under the Trump administration says will lead to an undercount. And then you add insult to injury by saying that the reason you're doing it is to enforce the Voting Rights Act, that it's part of the Trump program for Latino empowerment. That's why they're doing it. That's absolutely absurd. If you believe that...
Let me bring Mr. Nelson in, if I can, Congressman, because we do have limited amount of time. This will be the first time that this question has been asked as a general question. It's been asked sometimes to a small group of people, but as a general question in the census since 1950. What about the argument that this is an effort by the Trump administration to depress the count by frightening illegal immigrants?
Listen, I think that any questionnaire has the potential to be avoided. The point is to reach out to communities and encourage them to participate. There's no repercussions. This information cannot be shared, and there's no reason people shouldn't participate unless folks go out and scare them. And I would say that what's happening on this very show by Congressman Sherman might have more to do with scaring them than anything that I'm seeing from my end of the spectrum. I mean, tell people they are protected and encourage them to participate. My county has more poor people than most counties have people. Many of them are immigrants. We need federal money.
I just want to ask you, Congressman Sherman, Mr. Nelson is exactly right. The law expressly prohibits sharing any information from the census with any government, with any court. So why should anybody be afraid? And perhaps aren't you, by talking as you are, aren't you creating that fear?
I'm certainly trying not to create any fear, but the fact is immigrants come from countries with oppressive governments in many cases. And to convince them that a man who stands there and says these are rapists and murderers and must be pushed out of our country should get information about who's in your family and what their immigration status is, and that a Congress that includes people that say they're rapists and murderers isn't going to change the statute and use that as a deportation list to convince someone who's lived through the terrible situations in Guatemala and Honduras that they should go ahead and answer the census is going to be difficult. And to say that you're doing it to enforce the Voting Rights Act is absolutely absurd.
I want to switch to the other side of this, because while California is suing the federal government about including this question on the census, the federal government is suing California about its decision to enact laws that in effect make it a sanctuary state. And in fact, the Orange County supervisors voted this week to join the federal lawsuit against their own state of California. Here was President Trump this week.
Sanctuary cities where they protect criminals, they protect murderers, they protect people that you don't want on the streets. Other places in California said, we don't want that. First time they're speaking up.
Mr. Nelson, you were one of the Orange County Board of Supervisors members who voted to join the federal lawsuit against your own state. Why?
Well, it was my idea because we are put in an untenable position where our sheriff's deputies are precluded from talking to federal authorities if they know the authorities want to pick someone up because the person is here illegally, is charged with a crime, and our people can't even talk to the federal government unless there are some exceptions that are met, like they're a prior convicted felon. But we have people getting out every day that we don't want released without the federal government at least having an opportunity to put hands on and make their own decision whether these people ought to be released into the streets. We've had 244 people as of last week released that we could not stop, and our people could not tell ICE officials that we believe ICE would have wanted to speak with and likely wanted to do something about.
Congressman Sherman, you have said that Washington is violating the Constitution by putting this citizenship question in, but isn't California violating the Constitution by interfering with the federal government, which has supremacy when it comes to matters of immigration?
Well, Chris, we need comprehensive immigration reform. Until we get it, we'll be pulling our society apart.
Sir, you're not answering my question.
I'll get
Okay,
California is absolutely within its rights. And California has sued the Trump administration 29 times, and we haven't lost once.
You're not answering my question, which isn't immigration.
I will.
Well, let's get to it, because we're almost done, sir.
Yeah. Yes. The states and the federal government share sovereignty in our federal system. That's why Obamacare couldn't force the states to expand Medicaid. Even though that's a federal program, and even
in fact, when Arizona went further than the President Obama did, the Supreme Court said that they had overstepped their bounds. Under the Supremacy Clause, the federal government, what they say on immigration goes, and aren't you violating that?
The federal government establishes immigration policy, but whether California employees are going to spend California money and resources to help enforce that policy is a California decision. We will win that in court, and if the federal government can't compel states to participate in Medicaid, it can't compel states to become law enforcement authorities on immigration.
Of course, the Constitution didn't say anything about Medicaid, which didn't happen until the 1960s. It said something very specifically about immigration. Mr. Nelson, I'm going to give you 30 seconds for a final thought.
Right, and Chris, unfortunately, that's completely misleading. We don't want our people doing the federal government's job, nor do they have the time to do it. What California's law is requiring is our sheriffs not even cooperate, which is resulting in people that have committed crimes ending up on the streets of every county, but certainly Orange County. We got involved because we don't think that's right. We are tired of the state trying to use these arguments to prevent us from keeping the citizens safe.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Didn't think we were going to settle this, and we didn't. Congressman Sherman, Mr. Nelson, thank you both. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the continuing debate over immigration. Up next, we'll bring back the panel to weigh in on the census asking people if they are U.S. citizens and President Trump's new war on Amazon. All of that coming up.
How do you see the world? At Shriners Hospitals for Children,
We know that changing how you